Thank you for joining us. The first talk will begin in 2 minutes' time. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. There is a handout that you can download of the timetable too, if you want to click on that. We hope you enjoy.
Good morning, everyone. A huge welcome to you all to our fourth Wild Animal Welfare Committee conference, Translating Wildlife Welfare into Practice, Wildlife Management in the 21st Century. I'm Pete Goddard and I'm the chair of the Wild Animal Welfare Committee. I'm going to start the day off with a few thoughts by way of introduction and to put the event into context. So a big welcome to speakers and delegates from all around the world, and a particular thank you to those of you getting up early or staying up late to join us today. So here's a little plan of what I intend to cover in around 15 minutes or so. I'll tell you a little bit about the Wild Animal Welfare Committee. I'll address the question of why should we care about wild animal welfare. I'll cover the points about needing a systematic change of thinking in relation to wild animal welfare, and then I'll tell you a little bit about how the conference will run. Well, firstly, to say a little bit about the Wild Animal Welfare Committee itself, which was established as a charity in 2014, and over that time has had on or off about a dozen voluntary members, reflecting the breadth of the issues involved and we want to cover. The main reasons for establishing the Wild Animal Welfare Committee were to provide an independent evidence base for evaluating, monitoring, assessing and improving decisions affecting the welfare of free-living animals in the UK, increasing awareness of the importance and value of wild animals in general, to promote the welfare of individual wild animals, highlights the harm to and suffering of wild animals caused by human activity, with the aim of reducing these negative effects. And we've done our work through conferences and discussions, research reports, position pieces, inputs to various consultations, and a range of other engagements. WAWC has always tried to promote an evidence-based position, but of course the evidence we need to advocate better welfare for wild animals doesn't always exist. Across our previous three conferences, it can be seen that we are transitioning to a position where we can promote a more robust case for the need to protect the welfare of sentient wild animals. So we've covered a range of topics, as you can read from the slide. We've looked at the opportunities and threats for wild animal welfare. We've asked who are the guardians of wild animal welfare, and we've posed questions about wild animal welfare. Does it matter? Can it be assessed? And how can it be optimised? Well, on the slide, you can read the titles of today's four sessions. While some of these areas overlap, the attention is to move towards developing more inclusive, integrated systems thinking so that wildlife managers and others value and consider the welfare of individual wild animals as part of wider land stewarding. Shifting the paradigm to ensure wildlife ethics, welfare and flourishing are at the centre of decision making by organisers and others responsible for the ecosystem health of the land that they manage. This will include developing approaches to help engagement with those who hold differing views or are unaware of how individual animal welfare considerations could be incorporated into management practices at a range of scales. So the conference will explore routes to enhance engagement with organisations with wildlife management responsibilities to encourage more awareness of and concern for wildlife welfare. Now, as part of the backdrop for this, we aim to have a strong focus on wildlife welfare in the face of competing land use needs, ecological challenges and support for species at risk, integrating wildlife welfare into land stewardship in a compassionate way and looking at collaborative approaches and systems change. Part of this recognises that we are part of a partnership with the ecosystem and that wildlife welfare contributes to wider ecosystem health. So let's look at the first of the two main questions that I posed. Why should we care about wild animal welfare? Well, I have been critical of papers and reports where clear definitions, or at least the author's interpretation of these, are lacking. So I'd better not fall into the same trap. And so I give you here a WAWC definition of wild animal welfare. A wild animal experiences a good welfare state when its physical and mental needs are met, or where any compromise to these can be met by an animal being able to suitably adapt to its environment and achieve a stable state. So its ability to make a suitable response is an important aspect of its own welfare. So even over the first 10 years of WAWC's existence, we have seen quite a change in attitude towards the welfare of wild animals, perhaps especially in the European context. This has gone hand in hand, or perhaps been driven by a more widespread recognition of the possession of sentience by a growing range of taxa. This then implies that we need to be reflective of this in the way that we treat them. So likewise, here is a definition of sentience as produced by the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission. Salk defines animal sentience as the ability to have physical and emotional experience which matter to the animal and which can be positive or negative. Animal welfare is relevant to animals that have this ability. Thus, a sentient animal can experience, for example, pain and fear, and also comfort and enjoyment. Promoting animal welfare means increasing the positive experiences that an animal has and reducing the negative experiences. We recognise that sentient animals may have different cognitive and emotional capabilities, which means that they have different needs and wants. So it reflects again the importance of the individual. And actually the importance of the individual in wild animal welfare considerations is a key element, and possibly a failure to recognise the centrality of this has influenced some of the dissonance when conservation actions have seemingly attracted criticism from an animal welfare perspective. Now, much of this relates to animal consciousness, and a particular part of this, which is termed phenomenal consciousness, is also referred to as sentience. Now, as I've shown in the slide, sentience may mean different things to different species, even if they have different meaningful mental states, and something we can never really know for sure, but it's important to the individual, and that's what matters. This is analogous to the philosopher Daniel Dennett's intentional stance and the attribution of meaningful mental states to others. Now, quite a lot of debate has dwelt on which animals can have the relative subjective experiences. Having such experiences does not require sophisticated elements, such as language or reason, of course. Evidence points to a very wide range of animals, including all vertebrates and many invertebrates that can be sentient. So with mammals and birds, the evidence establishes strong scientific support for the attribution of consciousness. With other vertebrates and many invertebrates, evidence is growing to suggest that these have a realistic possibility of consciousness too. Keeping on the theme of why we should care about wild animal welfare, less than a month ago, the question received a boost following the publication of the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness. This considered which animals have the capacity for conscious experience. And while much uncertainty remains, some points of wide agreement have emerged. First, there is strong scientific support for the attribution of conscious experience to mammals and birds. And second, the empirical evidence indicates at least a realistic possibility of conscious experience in all vertebrates, including reptiles, amphibians and fishes, and many invertebrates, including, at a minimum, cephalopods, mollusks, decapod crustaceans and insects. And third, where there is a realistic possibility of conscious animal experience, it is irresponsible to ignore that possibility in decisions affecting that animal. We should consider welfare risks and use the evidence to inform our responses to these risks. So all of this requires us to care about animal welfare, and in terms of today's conference specifically, this requires us to pay equal regard to animals, whether domestic species or in the wild. Well, putting wild animal welfare in a wider context is something that I'm only going to touch on here, but the following is a concept that should focus the minds of those concerned about wild animal welfare and the notion of being human in a more than human world. For example, as advocated by David Abram, who is a cultural ecologist and philosopher. This refers to the worlds of different beings on Earth. So, do we need a systematic change of thinking? This is all about seeing people's place as being part of the natural world and the need to embrace other than human animals. The need to develop a more holistic and less anthropocentric view of wild animal welfare. How wild animal welfare relates to health and life-sustaining systems, and a shift in thinking from objects to processes and relationships. So this more than human reflection considers our complex web of relations with other beings in this world. It has led to a number of transformations that we could and should consider across a whole range of activities. And it's been articulated in this way as it allows non-human agencies, voices, presence to become more and more part of the sort of decision-making processes we need. It allows humans to understand and be more aware of the interconnectedness and interdependencies of their lives with non-human lives. It provides more complex and richer lenses to look into socio-economic and environmental issues and conflicts. And it highlights the question of how protection, conservation and preservation of nature have been developed, implemented and thought through. And finally, taking this approach, it reminds us that more than human care is primarily and intrinsically rooted in practice, and ultimately we need to enact this change through practice. So the thing we hope this conference will do is to encourage the translation of our current knowledge about wild animal welfare into more holistic, beneficial practice. Well, at a top level, we can see an example of this type of joined-up thinking from the One Health approach. And this is a graphic from the One Health high-level expert panel. One Health is an integrated, unifying approach to balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and the environment. It is particularly important to prevent, predict, detect, and respond to global health threats, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. But the concept equally applies to the continuum between animal health and welfare, human well-being and food security, and sustainability. And this, of course, relates to biodiversity loss and ecological resilience. One Health involves public health, veterinary and environmental sectors. The One Health approach is particularly relevant for food and water safety, nutrition, the control of zoonoses, pollution management, and combating antimicrobial resistance. The panel will also have a role in investigating the impact of human activity on the environmental and wildlife habitats. and how this drives disease threats, biodiversity loss, and climate change, and those that put increased pressure on the natural resource base, all of which can lead to the emergence of zoonotic disease. Well, the One Welfare approach concept mirrors the One Health idea and aims to provide a platform for fostering interdisciplinary collaboration to improve both human and animal welfare. So in this way, it can be seen as a subset of One Health and replicates some of the points that I just mentioned. This attempts to introduce a more holistic approach to ensure sustainable processes for human well-being, animal welfare, and environmental health. Now, while not a major element of One Welfare, you will see if you look closely that wildlife are included. Though the major thrust is on, for example, environmentally friendly animal keeping systems, there is the implicit notion that the way we care for animals impacts on humans, and in particular, the positive impacts between animal conservation and human well-being. So there's huge scope for this approach to become more widely recognised, and we can see the importance of ensuring that welfare of free-living wild animals is included. So if you want to find out more about this, you can have a look at Rebecca Garcia Pinolos's book and that I've shown you here. Well, part of this joined up perspective feeds into looking at the world in relation to what many have described as a multi-species justice, to rework a politics of knowledge and practice of political communication. In relation to this, WAWC has looked at how some of the descriptive terms we use should not be prejudicial to this consideration. We should move away from using pejorative terms such as pest or vermin, for example, as this may prejudice any debate about how certain free-living wild animals should be treated. There then needs to be an exploration of what commitment to multi-species justice might demand of politics and policy. We've yet to see how this can or should play out in our actions towards other species, especially wildlife, but clearly their welfare is of particular concern. It's also timely that one concrete action, though not necessarily driven by the multi-species justice approach, is the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. This is a call for the protection and revival of ecosystems all around the world for the benefit of people and nature. It aims to halt the degradation of ecosystems and restore them to achieve global goals. Only with healthy ecosystems can we enhance people's livelihoods, counteract climate change, and stop the collapse of biodiversity. Now, the UN Decade runs from 2021 through 2030, which is also the deadline for the Sustainable Development Goals and the timeline scientists have identified for the last chance to prevent catastrophic climate change. So looking back, the recently published New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness, coming from 39 leading philosophers and bioethicists, adds weight to our need to properly consider our human connection with nature, to think about the inner lives of animals, and consider our responsibilities to the whole biosphere. Well, at this point, I would like to flag up a couple of recent publications that can help us further with our deliberations, and you'll hear from some of these authors today. One aspect of what these books raise is the democratization of how we treat animals and having an open, informed discussion. So that's something WAWC is keen on promoting, especially in relation to wild animals. And of course, it's what today's meeting is all about, using the evidence we have to best effect when it comes to practical wildlife management to protect animal welfare in a whole variety of situations. So here in front of us are pictures of all of today's speakers. I'm not going to single out any for particular mention, as everyone is bringing a unique insight into different aspects of the theme of the conference. But we'll be hearing about cutting-edge research, hands-on wild animal management, ethical analysis, interactions between conservation and welfare, and posing important questions for the future. We've considered systems thinking in the WAWC recently, acknowledging the interdependence of different elements of the ecosystem, including humans and animals. Systems theory is a proactive mindset, exploring the factors, relationships, and interactions contributing to potential outcomes. It operates on the principle that when investigating an idea, in this case how we relate to wild animals and their welfare, one should ask always, how do we manage complexity? Because many of these on the ground situations are complex, and we want to do this without creating unintended consequences. So one aim of the conference is to look at this bigger picture from a number of angles. So to conclude, we're reaching a coming of age in our thoughts about animal consciousness and sentience. This is not just from an abstract point of view, but hand in hand with hard evidence. WAWC has always attempted to base its arguments for the compassionate treatment of wild animals on scientific findings and the evidence for animal sentience. During the conference, we'll be asked to think about many thorny questions, including exactly what responsibility, if any, we have for the welfare of free-living wild animals, which recognises that we're in a partnership with the ecosystem and that wildlife welfare contributes to wider ecosystem health and human well-being too. We really have a lot to look forward to today. So briefly, this is how the conference will run. After each opening presentation, we will take 5 minutes for specific questions. At the end of each session, except for the first, speakers will come together live for a more general discussion. You can find out about the speakers. You can post questions to be put to the speakers through the GoToWebinar platform. And we will be recording all the sessions and posting these on YouTube. Initially, this will be for delegates only. So finally, thank you all again for joining us. And if you've made a donation to WAWC, thank you very much. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you to my WAWC colleagues. Thank you to U4 for support and technical assistance. And we hope you will have a really informative and enjoyable day at the online conference. And don't forget, post your questions so we can have some excellent discussion sessions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Pete, and welcome to the first of our sessions. This is on wildlife welfare, making the case for a better engagement with wild animals. I'm Angus Nurse, one of the WAWC members that Pete referred to, and Professor of Law and Environmental Justice at Anglia Ruskin University. Before we start the presentations, I'd like to just remind everybody, if you have questions, you should post the questions using the question box, which should show up on the sort of right-hand side of your screen, hopefully, the navigation panel. If you are using a smartphone or a tablet, you may need to use the question symbol on your screen in order to ask questions. But otherwise, click on the arrow to where the question box is, which I think you should see at the bottom, and then you can post your questions. When doing so, please try to include and identify which speaker the question is for. And as Peter said, what we'll do is we'll take questions after each presentation and allow about 5 minutes for them. And in this first session, the speakers are not coming together, but hopefully we'll be able to deal with questions as we go through. So if I can introduce our first speaker, which is Danielle Celermajer from the University of Sydney.
Good morning. I'm recording this talk sitting in Quito, which is the second highest city in the world after La Paz and the capital of Ecuador, appropriately for my talk, the first country in the world to have enshrined the rights of nature in its constitution, which it did in 2008. The image you can see over my title is of Los Cedros, which is a protected forest in the north of the country. In 2021, the Constitutional Court of Ecuador ruled that mining in Los Cedros violated the constitutionally protected rights of nature and so was prohibited. Normally, though, I live and work on the unceded lands of the Dharawal people of the Yuin Nation on the southeast coast of Australia. I'd like to pay my respects to Yuin elders past, present and emerging, and to thank the people of that land for taking such care of the multi-species relations that make my work and life possible. I'd like to commence by throwing us back to what was happening on UN country, and specifically to the other animals whose home is UN country in late 2019 and early 2020. The images I'm about to show will be difficult for some of you to witness. They certainly are for me, even now, 4 years on from living through those fires. Nevertheless, because what happened to the animals with whom I share my home so powerfully and poignantly raises the questions that I'd like to reflect upon with you today, I felt compelled to begin with these animals' lives, their deaths, and the conditions of their survival. You may have seen these first two images. The first here is of a kangaroo carrying her joey. And the second one is of a koala, also with her baby hanging from her pouch. In both cases, what the images make obvious is that these particular animals have survived the immediate onslaught of the fire that has, as you can also see, decimated their habitat, their source of food, their source of water, and any protection that the bushland might have afforded them. If we pause a little longer on the images, two other aspects of the scene stand out. First, they're looking around them at the decimation, and I think we can assume without too much projection or problematic anthropomorphism, they're trying to make sense of what they are seeing, smelling, and otherwise sensing. It's not to say that they're making sense the same way as humans do, but as mammals whose survival depends on effectively navigating their landscapes, they are no doubt sense makers in their own right, and the world in which they now found themselves must have made pretty much no sense at all. In a way, less sense than it did for human survivors who had a narrative about the fire coming, about the fire burning, as well as about the larger background story of climate change and its impacts on the scale and severity of bushfires. The second aspect of the images you might notice is that they're deeply relational, involving in this case a mother trying to survive not only for herself, but for her still dependent young. From the research done on many mammals, on wolves, elephants, and in Australia on dingoes and kangaroos, we know that relationships, and specifically the presence of specific individuals, especially elder females, are critically important. They matter for a group's ability to survive, its capacity to navigate danger, and the possibility of transmitting knowledge across generations. They also matter to the quality of animals' experience. Many marsupials are deeply bonded with members of their families, and their deaths matter to them. The ecologist Chris Dickman and his team at my university estimated that the Black Summer fires killed or destroyed the habitat of over 3 billion animals. And of those who survived the immediacy of the fire, we can expect that most died. Of the 47 million marsupials in New South Wales fire zones, for example, only 886 were reported as being rescued. And of those rescued and given intensive medical care, more than half died. Kangaroos in particular, whose feet had always been burned, barely survived in the longer term. So we know about the death, although as I often say, there is knowing and there is knowing. 3 billion is an unfathomable number. If you spent just 10 seconds on each of the animals, that would take about 960 years, or 12 human lifetimes, doing nothing but contemplating those animals that summer in that country. These are the sorts of questions that the dominant forms of sense-making that we bring to other animals, at least in contemporary Western societies, refuse to ask, let alone answer. The image and the headline you see here came from an article published in The Guardian last year, where the impact of the Black Summer fires on other animals gets reduced to the analysis of trends in macro concepts like wildlife or perhaps biodiversity. My point is not that these larger frames don't matter, they do, but they're partial. The other questions we wouldn't hesitate to ask about humans, are for the most part dismissed when it comes to other animals as too anthropomorphic, although I'd argue that it's not in fact their anthropomorphism that stops us asking about them, but their implications. They were also the types of questions I tried to write about in my book Summertime, where I wanted to convey some of the lived experience that other animals had of the Black Summer fires. What then are the implications of bringing questions about other animals' experiential and relational worlds to our analysis of the impacts of climate change, and I would add to the impacts of the type of ecological collapse that colonial and capitalist forms of human life have brought to their worlds? Before tendering some tentative answers to that question, I want to say a few words about the framing of other animals, and more generally of beings other than humans, within dominant theories of justice. To be clear, I'm not speaking here about how other animals are held within systems that make no pretense of being just, but in theories of justice themselves. And the answer to my question is pretty straightforward. Only humans count as subjects of justice, or to be fully accurate, historically, and unfortunately still now in practice, even if not in law, only some humans count as subjects of justice. Those who are classified as being closer to animals because of their race, their indigeneity, their gender, or their disability gain only partial admission. In fact, if you go back to the Enlightenment ideas that gave rise to the idea of the moral dignity of the human individual, and out of that the idea of human rights, what you find is that what made individual humans morally valuable, or what made them subjects of justice, was precisely their or our supposed superiority to other animals. We became subjects of justice, we acquired dignity, precisely, according to these theories, when we left behind our animal nature. Other animals might merit human concern or human beneficence. In fact, the great theorist of the Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant, wrote that humans ought not be cruel to animals because such forms of behaviour eroded our moral sensibilities and so made it more likely that we would act unjustly towards other humans. That view is, of course, no mere anachronism. How many contemporary international and national frameworks and laws, and indeed scholarly frameworks for the protection of biodiversity, adopt the framing of ecosystem services and instrumentalise biodiversity or ecological functioning as necessary means for human health and well-being. The first quote that you have here is from an article in Nature, and the second is the first provision of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. There are, though, challenges to this understanding of justice and to this understanding of other animals. I'm going to speak about just one of them, the one I work on, which we call a theory of multispecies justice. Multispecies justice, or MSJ as we call it because it's such a mouthful, has at its foundation several key principles. First, it rejects hierarchies of being, and it specifically rejects the idea that the qualities or characteristics that make us different to others, after all, we are all different from each other, but that those characteristics that make humans different also uniquely qualify us to be subjects of justice or subjects of moral concern. More positively, it insists that all earth beings are subjects of justice. Second, and closely following from that first principle, multi-species justice theory refuses the idea that how morally worthy a being is depends on their proximity to the human. The moral worth of other beings needs to be evaluated in their own terms, as well as in terms of the part they play in maintaining good relationships or the functioning and flourishing of larger ecological relationships. Third, and the seeds of this principle were already present in the second principle, because all life is entangled or interdependent, The appropriate unit or scale for thinking about justice is not only the individual or individuals, but always also the relationship within which individuals are embedded. Now, I should add here that there is disagreement amongst theorists of multi-species justice about the correct balance between the focus on individuals and the focus on relationships. Some of my colleagues think that we ought only be looking at relationships or systems and how well they're functioning and flourishing. I think that a robust theory of multi-species justice has to take individuals seriously as subjects of their own lives, even as we recognise that an individual's capacity to live and to live well cannot be separated from the ecological relationships within which we are always embedded. Okay, that was a pretty long detour into theories of justice. I hope that you bore with me. And now I want to get back to the question that motivated that detour. What are the implications of these theories of justice for wildlife welfare work? That is, of course, a huge question and one that will need to be answered through many conversations between people like you who work in the wildlife welfare area and people like me who work on multi-species justice. For purposes of today, I'm going to tender three types of answers. The first two are located squarely in the context of climate change and climate change-driven disasters, where other animals are unambiguously subjected to climate injustice. So first, because climate change has so radically shifted the background of ecological stability, humans bear a positive obligation to intervene to protect other animals from the impacts of climate change, including climate-driven disasters like catastrophic fires. The idea that nature ought to be left alone or that human intervention, save with respect to, say, invasive species, is a bad thing just makes no sense. There is no nature in which humans have not drastically and negatively intervened. During the Black Summer fires, the entire effort of state agencies was directed towards saving and protecting human life and human property. Save the celebrated protection of the sole remaining natural stand of Wollemi pines in the Blue Mountains, the state left nature and animals being burnt to death by our fires entirely to their own devices. Community organisations, by contrast, self-organised to try to protect and rescue or care for animals, not only without state support, but often with positive reprimand. Because of the absolute moral priority of humans, and because in this case, saving animals or their ecosystems had a lower instrumental value, attending to them did not make it onto the list of concerns. Going back to what I said earlier about the difference between traditional theories of justice and multi-species theories of justice, they didn't show up as subjects of justice. Now, of course, from a wildlife welfare point of view, positive intervention can't only be at the level of saving or protecting individual animals in the midst of disasters, and this takes me to my second answer. The picture you see here is of a whumpu fruit dove. These birds live in the Gondwana rainforests of northern New South Wales. In 2019, over half of those rainforests burned. We believe for the first time they had ever burned at all. In the aftermath of the fires, because of the interdependent relationship between the rainforest and this dove, along with the paradise riflebird, recovery was particularly difficult. As Josh Lee, the lead author of the study looking at this question, said, and I quote, "These fruit eaters disperse rainforest seeds over large distances. Rainforests need these birds to eat and then disperse the seeds for them to grow in other parts of the rainforest. If we don't have the pigeons and doves to help the fire-affected areas of the rainforest to regenerate, we're in real trouble." End of quote. And of course, I would add, without the rainforest fruits, the birds could not survive. So following from the third principle of multi-species justice, during this era of ecological collapse and climate change, there is a particular obligation to support the flourishing and functioning of good ecological relationships. This cannot be a defeasible value sacrificed in the name of human development. Protecting and nurturing those relationships has to be seen as a matter of justice. This takes me to the third and most radical answer. If animals are to be taken seriously as subjects of justice, they have to have a say in the decisions that affect them. Now, this might seem like a crazy idea, but bear with me for a moment. The basic principle underlying democracies is the idea that anyone who is affected by a decision ought to have a say in it. This is sometimes known as the all affected interest principle. When, for example, women were fighting for justice, they didn't think it was enough for men to take them into consideration when they were making decisions, but to continue to exclude women from the decision-making table. They insisted on a seat at the table. The same is true in the disability movement. Think about the slogan, "Nothing about us without us." The same is self-evidently true when it comes to other animals. Decisions about development, infrastructure, food systems, extraction, energy production, to name just a few issues, have massive impacts on them, but they have absolutely no input into decision-making processes that lead to the decisions that will shape and, for the most part, end or at least disfigure their futures. The real cutting edge of multi-species justice work when it comes to biodiversity and conservation is getting animals and ecosystems on which their lives depend directly represented in decision-making processes. Again, this might seem like a very far-out idea, but just in the last 3 years, a number of companies have put nature on their boards, legally and with a vote in the decisions they make. And one of the groups I work with, Animals in the Room, is developing a number of experiments in representing wild animals in the context of human-animal conflicts in the US, Europe, and Africa. There are, of course, a huge number of questions about how to do this, including the following. When we're at this stage of experimentation, how do we enroll or convince organisations that this is a good idea and get them to be willing to try it? Who's qualified to represent other animals or to stand in as their proxy? Are other forms of representation possible, for example, through film or some other source of data on their lives and experience? Could we even try for more direct forms of immersion or direct participation? How would representatives be held accountable to the animals they represent? And who ought to be represented? Should it be species, individuals, ecosystems, all of the above? And how should their interests be weighted? Now, admittedly, we're in the early days of trying to answer these questions, and they're hugely challenging, not least because our habits of thought and practice so systematically exclude even asking them. But that makes them only more, not less important, and only more, not less matters of justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. We have one question, which is, Daniela has drawn a lot on Hannah Arendt's work and the way she tried to make sense of devastating and apocalyptic catastrophes, including the Holocaust. Some of her contemporaries, including Sartre, have written about the challenge of making sense of the shadow of war creeping over a society. Can you say more about how, from a justice point of view, we can make sense of the planetary threats we face? And I think that's a question that's come from Glenn.
Thank you so much. And hi, everybody. It's very strange to be answering questions when I can't see any of you. I'm no longer in Ecuador. I'm now back in Australia. So good to be here with you. That's a really terrific question. And Glenn, you are right. Hannah Arendt has been one of the main theorists on whose work I've drawn. And I think this question of sense making and its relationship with theories of justice, and more importantly, practices of justice, really gets to the heart of why multi-species justice as a theory has emerged and taken off in the way that it has in recent years. that the sense making that one could say has driven us to this point of catastrophic climate change, biodiversity loss, and ecological collapse is a sense making in which a certain form of human life understands and treats other animals and the more than human more broadly as resource to be extracted for human profit and human gain. And so the type of radical confrontation that at least some of us are having now with the implications of planetary collapse, I think shows what that sense making does to the world, what it enables, but also what it disables, what it impedes in terms of flourishing relationship. And so we're being forced, and people often ask me, you know, how did I come to think about theories of justice from a multi-species perspective? And of course, there are theoretical answers to that question, but it really was about a confrontation with a world where there is an unraveling occurring that we cannot make sense of, because all of the narratives of the Enlightenment and modernity that talk about progress and things are going to get better and better, and human beings can always develop some technological or scientific solution to deal with the problems. Those type of sense-making frameworks are no longer capable of making sense of what's going on, let alone of bringing us to a new point of relationship. And so it seems to me that a theory of justice founded on a very fundamentally different way of making sense about who humans are in relationship with the more than human world is really the upshot of the encounter with the type of crisis that we're facing. You know, I would say a much greater crisis even than the one that I faced. So thanks for the question.
Super, thanks very much. We've got time for just one more, I think, although there are two in the questions. And this is: are there any other examples? Sorry, are there any other examples of organisations or advocates who are representing animals at the table?
There's a bunch of experiments that are taking place now. Interestingly enough, a lot of them are happening in artistic spaces, so fairly experimental spaces. And often from a policy point of view, that gets dismissed as not real politics. But I think we often see in artistic movements, that's where the avant-garde is. I mentioned very briefly in the talk the organisation that I'm working with, Animals in the Room, where we're beginning to stage a number of experiments of trying to bring animal representation. I actually prefer the term inclusion to representation, because I think we shouldn't foreclose the possibility that there will be more direct forms of participation. It would mean a much more radical recasting of what politics looks like. But at the moment, we're very much at this experimental stage. It's not only the representation or the inclusion of animals that's being thought about, it's also more broadly the more than human. And interestingly enough, really the most, we've seen the greatest institutional developments in the field of law, not in the field of politics. So if you think about something like the rights of nature, the personhood of rivers, the Wanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or the rights of the constitutional decisions about the rights of nature in Ecuador, where the judges have actually gone out and looked at what does it mean for a river to function and flourish, and how does that get impeded. Those are really where we're seeing the most institutional innovations, but hopefully politics is going to be next.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you, Danielle. I'm going to move us on to our next speaker, which is Mark Jones from Born Free. I'm aware we've got other questions that are in the question box, but we'll maybe look at those with written answers. So delighted to introduce Mark Jones from Born Free.
Hello everyone, my name's Mark Jones. I'm a veterinarian, and through my career I've worked in veterinary practice in the UK with companion and farmed animals before travelling extensively and working in wildlife rescue and rehabilitation in South America and Asia. Since 2008, I've been working in the wildlife NGO sector, focusing on international policy work. And in 2014, I joined the Born Free Foundation, based in the south of England, where I'm currently head of policy. Before I start, just a quick word about the organisation I work for. Born Free was formed in 1984 by the actors Virginia McKenna and Bill Travers and their son Will. The charity was named after the classic 1966 film the actors starred in, which told the story of conservationists Joy and George Adamson, who rescued a lioness cub called Elsa and successfully returned her to the wild in Kenya. The charity was originally called Zoo Check and was focused on highlighting the plight of wild animals in zoos and other captive facilities and the associated animal welfare concerns. While these days Born Free has expanded its activities to include field conservation projects, education and policy work, the charity has always retained its core focus on the welfare and well-being of individual animals and continues to promote the incorporation of animal welfare considerations into all human activities that involve or affect wildlife. To that end, we promote compassionate conservation, which aims to fully incorporate welfare considerations into conservation programs and practice, and we expose and seek to reduce harmful wildlife exploitation. I think we'd all agree that animal welfare is important. Many would consider improving animal welfare to be a moral and ethical imperative, and I'd count myself among them. I would also strongly argue that a focus on securing high standards of animal welfare is essential for successful wildlife conservation. It's clearly important in order to maximise the chances of success of the rescue and rehabilitation of individual wild animals, which can form an important component of conservation efforts. And it's vital to reintroduction and rewilding efforts, which are becoming an increasing feature of nature restoration programs. But there is also increasing recognition of the social and cultural complexity of animal groupings for many species and the importance of taking this into account throughout conservation practice to ensure social cohesion. We're beginning to understand that individual animals are important to and play different roles in family groups and wider populations, and that their welfare and well-being needs to be taken into account. However, getting policymakers and some conservation practitioners to recognise the importance of animal welfare remains challenging. And the cumulative impacts of climate change, habitat loss and degradation, pollution, escalating exploitation, invasive species, and some of the responses to COVID-19 and other human health risks are resulting in something of a tsunami of pressures on wild animals, which is not only damaging for species and biodiversity conservation, but also exacerbates welfare harms. The question is, could the global crises we currently face provide opportunities to promote wider recognition of the importance of animal welfare and its incorporation into conservation policy and practice? Arguably, we're facing three major global crises. First, the climate crisis, driven principally by greenhouse gas emissions resulting in global warming, which presents enormous challenges to all life on Earth. As I'm sure we're all aware, 2023 was recently declared the hottest year on record, with the Met Office declaring that global average temperature last year was 1.46 centigrade above the pre-industrial baseline, perilously close to the objective of maintaining any rise below a 1.5 centigrade ceiling. We need to reduce global net CO2 emissions by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, reaching net zero around 2050 to meet current targets, and at current rates of progress we will fail. Second, we have the crisis facing global biodiversity. The 2019 Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services concluded that 1 million species are at risk of extinction, and a paper released since suggests the number of species at risk could be double this. that nature's decline is unprecedented, that extinction rates are accelerating, that the current global response is inadequate, and that transformative changes to our relationship with the natural world are urgently needed. And of course, we have the global human health crisis. COVID-19 has resulted in more than 700 million reported cases and almost 7 million reported deaths. At its peak, almost 4 million cases were being recorded every day. The pandemic brought the world to a virtual standstill and led to huge economic consequences. But COVID-19 is just the latest in a long line of pandemics, albeit arguably the most devastating to date. The UN talks of an era of pandemics with outbreaks of new and emerging infectious diseases becoming increasingly common. 3/4 of new and emerging infectious diseases that affect people are believed to be of zoonotic or animal origin, and more than 70% of these originate from wildlife. And many undiscovered viruses with pandemic potential are thought to exist in mammal and avian hosts. Arguably, the reason why zoonoses and pandemics are emerging more frequently reflect the ways humans interact with and exploit wildlife. We're seeing relentless development in pursuit of economic growth and associated destruction of wildlife habitats, increasing contact and conflict between people and wild animals. We're also seeing exponential growth in wildlife trade and trafficking and the commodification of wild animals as exotic foods, traditional medicines, health tonics, pets, high-end gifts, status symbols or investments. Wild animals are collected, farmed, transported, exported and traded in huge numbers, and the associated crowding, stress and injury provide the perfect environment for pathogens to emerge, mutate and spread. And the close proximity to people when they're traded and sold creates the opportunity for human transmission. So we're facing these three major crises, and there is an increasing recognition that they're all interlinked, and you can't find solutions to them in isolation from each other. Protecting nature and wildlife is key to climate change mitigation. Biodiversity absorbs greenhouse gases, provides a natural carbon store, and buffers against extreme weather and its consequences. Conserving ecosystems is more cost-effective than human-made interventions, and we're increasingly seeing nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches to climate change. And there's some really interesting work by organisations such as Rebalance Earth on the carbon sequestration value of individual animals such as great whales and elephants, and how to measure and realise this value. Limiting global warming is also key to protecting wildlife and nature. As the world warms up and environments change, many animals and plants find it increasingly difficult to thrive, and this is resulting in profound impacts on wildlife populations and the wider ecology through, for example, shifts in species abundance and distribution and changes in predator-prey relationships. At the recent meeting of the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals in Uzbekistan, the 130-odd signatory governments agreed on a strengthened resolution on climate change and endorsed a very worrying report on the impacts of climate change on migratory species. And protecting nature and wildlife is also key to preventing future pandemics. Most pandemics originate in wild animals, but it's only when we disrupt, exploit and stress them that we create the conditions in which pathogens are likely to emerge, proliferate, mutate and spill over to other animals and potentially to people. So how does animal welfare fit into these considerations? I'll start with a quote from Paula Akari, formerly of the Centre for Human Animal Studies at Edge Hill University, who said, Situated alongside and intertwined with climate change and the relentless destruction of wild nature, the global COVID-19 pandemic should have instigated serious reflection on our profligate use and careless treatment of other animals. And as far back as 2010, Paquet and Darrimont stated, "A well-accepted and applied ethical foundation for animal conservation that considers animal welfare is lacking." Many other writers and thinkers have been speaking and publishing about the need for transformative changes to our relationship with wild animals. In addition to considering animal welfare as an ethical and moral imperative, we need to see it as a vital component for successful wildlife conservation and ecosystem protection and restoration, by extension for climate change mitigation, and for preventing and mitigating the risk of future pandemics. So animal welfare is a very practical as well as a moral and ethical consideration. For these reasons, it's vital that we integrate animal welfare into the international and national political agenda. As I've said, getting welfare onto the international political agenda is challenging. Nevertheless, we have seen some progress in recent times. In the 2019 United Nations Sustainable Development Report, it states the clear links between human health and well-being and animal welfare are increasingly being recognised, and strong governance should safeguard the well-being of both wildlife and domesticated animals, with rules on animal welfare embedded in transnational trade. The 2020 United Nations Environment Programme report on preventing the next pandemic said strengthened sanitary requirements must go beyond public food markets and include the entire supply chain for domestic and wild meat, including both farmed and captured wildlife. Adoption of animal welfare standards for the care, housing and transport of live animals along the entire supply chain is also needed to reduce the risk of zoonotic disease transmission. Additional restrictions on which species can be legally sold should also be considered. And animal sentience is also increasingly recognised in legal and policy frameworks. For example, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, the African Union Animal Welfare Strategy for Africa, and UK legislation through the Animal Welfare Sentience Act 2022. In February 2022, the United Nations Environment Assembly, or UNEA, which has 193 member states and dubs itself the world's highest level decision-making body on the environment, adopted a resolution on the animal welfare, environment and sustainable development nexus, which recognises that animal welfare, biodiversity and the environment are connected to human well-being, acknowledges that there is a strong body of science supporting animal sentience, and calls on UNEA member states to protect animals and their habitats and meet their animal welfare requirements in the context of halting biodiversity loss, restoring ecosystems, mitigating climate change, preventing pollution, reducing the risk of new emerging infectious zoonotic disease, moving to sustainable and agroecological food systems, and achieving sustainable development. And in December 2022, the UN's Convention on Biological Diversity adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which sets the international framework for biodiversity legislation and policy for the decades to come. While there's no explicit reference to animal welfare in the framework, welfare is included in the operational objectives of the CBD's draft Global Action Plan for Biodiversity and Health, which aims, and I quote, to mainstream biodiversity and health linkages through sector-specific plans, including in the health sector, with a view to reducing the common drivers of biodiversity loss and health impacts, and thus promoting the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity alongside human well-being and animal welfare. This action plan is due to be adopted at the Convention on Biological Diversity's meeting in Colombo in October. These and other international mechanisms may seem esoteric at times, but they do create the international frameworks under which national legislation and associated action plans are based. So the recognition of animal welfare within these mechanisms gives us a great deal to build on. There are some important initiatives that can be used to promote the incorporation of animal welfare into wildlife conservation and protection efforts. The One Health initiative aims to bring together multiple sectors and disciplines working to attain optimal health for people, animals and the environment at local, national and global levels. This is already embraced by a number of international organisations and national governments. It's referenced in the Global Biodiversity Framework, and it could form the basis for the International Pandemics Agreement currently under negotiation at the World Health Organization. In December 2021, a definition of One Health was adopted by the World Health Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the United Nations Environment Programme, which for the first time includes reference to the importance of well-being. The One Welfare approach, which has been spearheaded by UK-based Spanish veterinarian Dr. Rebecca Garcia, who will be known to many of you, is arguably broader than One Health in that it promotes the recognition that animal welfare, the well-being of biodiversity and the environment are all connected to human well-being. One Welfare offers a holistic approach and a tool to support disease risk mitigation, while also contributing to efforts aimed at addressing broader welfare issues in relation to the biodiversity and climate crises. And it aims to promote key global objectives, including supporting food security, achieving sustainability, reducing human suffering, and improving productivity within the farming sector, all through a better understanding of the value of high animal welfare standards. It's by demonstrating the links between improvements to animal welfare and these key objectives, all of which are closely linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, that we can make progress towards embedding improved animal welfare into international and national legislation and policy, and achieving the key objective of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is, and I quote, "a world in which humanity lives in harmony with nature and in which wildlife and other living species are protected." We have also been promoting the adoption and implementation of the International Consensus Principles for Ethical Wildlife Control, published in 2017. These important principles are designed to help guide animal management practices in order to minimise animal harms, and I believe Adam Grogan will be speaking more about this later in the programme. So going forward, the key objectives for those of us working on international policy mechanisms with an animal welfare focus should include integrating animal health and welfare through the adoption of One Health and One Welfare approaches to augment efforts to reduce zoonotic disease risk, protect and conserve wildlife and biodiversity, and by extension tackle the climate crisis. Reframing the sustainable use narrative to incorporate human and animal health risks and animal welfare concerns, valuing and mainstreaming wildlife and nature protection and animal welfare into all decision making, and adopting robust implementation mechanisms and ensuring adequate resourcing for wildlife and nature protection. If we're to be successful in fully incorporating wildlife protection and animal welfare into international and national legislation and policy making, we need to not only promote it as a moral and ethical imperative, but also as a key mechanism for tackling the crises we currently face and as a vital component for successful wildlife conservation. So with that, I'll close this talk. I hope that's been interesting and maybe informative. I'd like to thank the organisers of the conference for inviting me to speak today, and I'd be happy to try and answer any questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. That was indeed interesting and informative. Hopefully we can, there's a couple of questions for you that have come up, and hopefully we can squeeze two in before the next, at least two in before the next speaker. So first one, Mark, do you get the feeling that those in a position of responsibility or those who lead public opinion really get it in relation to the interdependencies of wildlife conservation and welfare and human well-being? Things seems to be moving very slowly to me. We are running out of time.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for that question. There's a good question. I think, as I said in the talk, I think it's a challenge to get policymakers at a high level and you know, at international levels and national levels, and in some cases conservation practitioners, to recognise the importance and interrelationship between improving animal welfare and improving conservation outcomes, wildlife protection outcomes, and ultimately turning the corner in terms of the biodiversity crisis and you know, the relationship that that has with the other crises that we currently face and are trying to tackle. I think that it is slowly changing. I'm actually in Vienna as we speak at the moment at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, trying to convince delegates from countries all over the world that we need to be much more focused on tackling wildlife trafficking and ensuring that wildlife trafficking is in doing so that we tackle the issues that cause enormous stress and mortality amongst wild animals. It is a challenge. I think things are shifting. They're shifting very, very slowly. The approach we've taken is to say, okay, you know, talking to high-level policymakers specifically about animal welfare hasn't perhaps got us where we need to be. So that's why we need to link improvements to animal welfare to these other issues, which are very much on the, you know, in the minds and on the agendas of policymakers. But I agree, it's a challenge. It's not happening quickly enough. We're doing all we can to try and change that.
Thanks, Mark, and just squeeze in one more, which is, Mark, thanks for your excellent overview in which you make reference to the importance of transformation. Can I ask whether you have integrated ecological and vertical literacy at organisational and societal levels into your thinking about the transformative change we need to nurture? If you could do that in 2 minutes, Mark, that'd be great.
Yes, and you know, we need to be looking. I mean, as an organisation, we're a relatively small non-government organisation focused on wildlife protection and wild animal welfare. But you know, we've recognised that what we're really in the business of here is human behaviour change, and you know, in order to achieve human behaviour change, we need to be working with not just policymakers, but also communities on the ground that live close to wild animals, and trying through members of those communities. It's not us that go and do this, you know, it's community members themselves that do this, to recognise the value of wildlife, not just for its own sake, and the value of changing the way that we interact with wildlife, not just for its own sake, but also ultimately for the good of all of us. But that's, you know, it's a big job. We're a small NGO. There are many others, thankfully, involved in this initiative. As I say, I think we're making some progress. It's really good to see things like the Business for Nature Forum, which is bringing big businesses together to look at some of these issues and to try and encourage business and the commercial sector to move. We're very much involved at a political level and also, as I said, a community level through the field projects that we run. I think you have to look at this from all levels, and you have to figure out what transformative change really means, and you know, the steps that you need to take to achieve it. But at the end of the day, it's all about human behaviour change.
That's excellent. Thanks very much. I'd like to thank Mark for his talk and move on to the third speaker in this session, which is Heather Browning from the University of Southampton.
Hi everyone, I'm Heather Browning from the University of Southampton, and today I'm going to be talking about the positive aspects of wild animal welfare and what a good life feels like for a free-living wild animal. So to outline, I'll begin by talking about what positive welfare is. I will then move on to discussing some of the sources of positive welfare for wild animals, and then I'll finish up with a little bit of a discussion about how we can assess welfare in the wild, although I expect we'll also see some other talks about this as we move on through the day. So to begin with, what is positive welfare? So there are many different definitions of welfare, and it's important that when we're talking about animal welfare, we're clear about what definition it is that we're using. So the three most common definitions that we see when people are talking about animal welfare is physical functioning, natural living, and the animal's affective state or its feelings. And it's important that we're clear about which version of welfare we're using, because the way that we conceptualize welfare can affect the way that we do research and also the decisions that we make about animals and what is good for them. So to begin with, if we take the physical functioning account of welfare, this takes an animal to have good welfare when it has good physical functioning or bodily health and fitness. Now, I think this definition is a bit too limited because it leaves out a lot of the things that we might think matter for the welfare of animals, such as their psychological states. An animal might have generally good physical functioning, but it may be scared or bored or frustrated. And we typically think that that animal will have poor welfare, whether or not it also has that good physical functioning. So it makes sense, I think, to think of the physical functioning in an animal as an instrumental part of its welfare. That is, that having poor physical functioning will influence its welfare, because an animal that's sick or injured will have feelings of pain or nausea, or will be restricted from performing behaviours it wants to perform, but it won't itself justify what is good or poor welfare. Next, we have the concept of welfare as natural living. And here we think that an animal will have good welfare if it's living according to its evolved natural history. So it's living as the type of animal that it evolved to be, in a way that is normal or natural for its species. Now, a big problem with this account is that it can't really account for wild animals having poor welfare, because these animals are, in almost all cases, living as they evolved to do in their natural habitats and showing their natural behaviours. But some of those animals may have poor welfare through things like predation or aggression with other members of their species. And so here, even though those things are perfectly natural, we might think they're not very good for welfare. So it's not the naturalness itself that is contributing to the welfare, but again, we might think of this more as an instrumental point of view, where natural behaviours often contribute to an animal's welfare because the evolved psychological reward mechanisms that are attached to them will make these natural behaviours feel good to animals, so they're motivated to perform them. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but I think it makes a lot of sense to think about the natural living view of animal welfare also as an instrumental one. So finally, we come to what I think is probably one of the more popular views now within animal welfare, and that is animal welfare as its affective state. And so here we think of an animal as having good welfare in terms of its balance of positively and negatively valent subjective states, which are sometimes called affects or feelings. And so here we can see that an animal will have good welfare when it has mostly positive states, and it will have poor welfare when it has mostly negative mental states. And here we can think of welfare as, a continuum that moves from poor all the way up to good, and this is related to whether or not this animal has a life worth living or not, whether it's going to have a predominance of positive or negative experiences. Now, when related to this view of welfare, if we think of welfare as consisting in the affective states or the feelings of animals, this relates then to the concept of sentience. So Sentience refers to an animal's capacity for felt experience. And an animal is sentient if it's able to experience different positively and negatively valenced feelings. And so, often these are described just as pleasures and pains, but we can think of them as a range of other states as well. So think of hunger or pain or nausea, feelings of thirst, feelings of joy, feelings of curiosity, feelings of thermal comfort or resting comfort. The ability to experience these feelings, that there is something that it's like to feel them, such that there is for you or I, and that there is not for, say, a table or a chair. That's the difference between being sentient and not being sentient. Now, we think of sentience as relevant because sentience matters morally. So a lot of philosophers have paid a lot of attention to the fact that if an animal is sentient, that means they have the capacity to suffer. And if they have the capacity to suffer, then that means we should care about what is going on for them. We should care about their welfare. We should care about how well or poorly their lives are going. So quite famously, the philosopher Jeremy Bentham has this quote here where he says, what is it that should trace that insuperable line? And here he's talking about the line that separates beings that we care about morally from those that we don't. And he says, the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And here he's really emphasizing that what we care about when we're thinking about our moral duties towards other animals is not their intelligent capacities, not their capacities to speak with us, but just that more basic capacity to suffer, that capacity of sentience. Sentience has become increasingly important in legislation around the world. So there are now a number of different countries and states that have written animal sentience into their legislation as part of the protections for animals to protect sentient animals from harm. And most recently, that includes the UK, where the Animal Welfare Sentience Act has recognised that some animals are sentient beings, and for that reason we need to protect their interests and to take them into account, to consider their interests, to consider their welfare when we're making political and social decisions. So the question then rises, which animals are sentient? If we think that sentience matters, we also want to think about which animals does this include. And now, obviously, we can't know for sure which animals are sentient. We're talking, of course, about private mental states and feelings that animals have, within their own heads. We can't ask them directly, but we can gather evidence that helps, suggest to us that animals are likely to be sentient. And based on the recent Animal Welfare Sentience Act, these are the animals that are currently legally recognised as sentient within the UK. So that includes mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, cephalopod mollusks like octopuses, and decapod crustaceans such as crabs, lobsters, and shrimp. And so for these animals, we have sufficient evidence that it's worth treating them as sentient and considering their interests when we're thinking about policy. So then there's a very strong link between sentience and welfare in the way that I've just presented it. If we think of sentience as the capacity for felt experience and welfare as the quality of felt experience, how good or bad that experience is for the animal, then we can see that sentient animals are welfare subjects. Sentient animals have a welfare that we should care about, and those are the animals that we need to think about protecting. So we've talked a bit about how positive welfare refers to how an animal is feeling, and now I want to talk about what are the sources of positive welfare experience for animals in the wild. So often when people are talking about wild animal welfare, there's a lot of focus on the sources of suffering for wild animals. So people spend a lot of time looking at all the different ways in which life can go badly for wild animals, both in terms of natural experiences such as predation or droughts, and also human-caused sources of suffering such as bushfires or hunting or trapping animals or pest control. But alongside these sources of suffering, we also need to keep in mind that wild animals have a lot of sources of pleasure as well. So it's not enough to just list all the bad things that can happen to wild animals. We need to think about what are all the good things that can happen in their lives as well. And these can include things like the experience of play. So this little photo here taken from a video showing a crow essentially sledding down a snowy roof by using the lid of a container and then flying back up and doing it again, seemingly for no other reason than because they enjoy it. There are also pleasures that are associated with social experiences and interactions that animals can have with each other, pair bonds through parental care. All these different things can be ways for animals to experience pleasure out in the wild. And so when we're thinking about what their lives are like, we need to also reflect on the sources of positive experience. And when we think about the evolution of affective states of the animal's feelings, it makes sense to think that there are also going to be pleasant experiences, because affective states have a motivational role to help animals motivate certain behaviours and help them decide what they want to do at a given moment. And so we can think that, negative affects, negative feelings, promote animals to avoid certain things, and positive affects reward useful behaviours that animals make. And so when we think about how this works, we can think that most negative affects are then going to have counterbalancing positive affects associated with them. So even when we think about the negative things that animals can experience that usually relate to certain bodily needs that are unmet, the meeting of those needs is then going to have a positive affect associated with it. So for instance, an animal may feel hungry, which is negative, but when it eats, then it will feel the pleasures of novel foods, the taste pleasures, and also the pleasant sensations of fullness. An animal may have the negative experience of feeling cold, but then associated with that, once it warms up, there's that positive feeling of thermal comfort once it gains that. And so when we think about, bodily needs as they're being unmet might feel bad, once they're met, they're going to feel positive. And so animals have all these opportunities for positive experiences in meeting their bodily needs. There are also additional sources of pleasure available for animals, and many natural behaviours that animals are evolved to perform for various reasons will be rewarding for those wild animals. So for instance, a study a few years ago showed that birds might find singing intrinsically pleasurable. So when we think of a wild bird doing its bird song, the chemical signals that you see in its brain are those associated with pleasure. And so, the animal is singing, of course, because it helps its fitness to help it, attract mates or to defend a territory. But at the same time, the immediate reason the animal is doing this behaviour is because it feels good. And so if we think that having this positive feeling motivates these animals to perform the behaviours they need to perform, it makes a lot of sense that they're going to have pleasure associated with many of the natural behaviours that they do every day. There may also be just a baseline positive experience that animals have beyond any of these sort of additional behaviours or bodily needs. And this has been called the joy of living. The idea is here that, in order to sort of additionally motivate an animal just to stay alive and to continually move around and explore its environment, it might have this baseline positive feeling about life itself. And in particular, just the basic forms of exploration and investigation, so moving around in its environment, learning new information, seeing new things, are likely to be themselves positively valenced, because these are the things that help an animal gain knowledge about its environment, which again are really, really important things for it to know if it wants to survive and reproduce in the wild. And so Jaak Panksepp, who talked a lot about the basic affective states that animals might have, called this the seeking system. Animals seeking to find out more about their environment, and that this was thought to be a positively valenced experience. So this is another range of sort of positive experiences that wild animals can have. Finally, we can think about the opportunities for agency, choice, and control. Now, within animal welfare science, there's been an increasing discussion about the role of agency, choice, and control, and what it means for animal welfare. And particularly, it's based on results that show that animals show quite a strong preference for exercising their agency. And this seems to be associated with a positive welfare experience. So for instance, this top picture here has got an elephant within a zoo. He can press a button and receive a shower whenever he wants. Animals are likely to take these opportunities when they can. On the bottom, there's a picture of a giraffe here using a puzzle feeder to gain its food. And there's a phenomenon known as contra-freeloading, which suggests that animals actually prefer to receive their food through something like a puzzle feeder in a way that is challenging for them, that makes them work for their food, instead of just receiving that food for free. And so if we think that, just exercising their agency and meeting a challenge and working to obtain the resources that they need is also got a positive impact on wild animal lives, it's something that they want and is good for them, then we can see that there are probably lots of opportunities for wild animals to gain more positive experiences, because there are lots of opportunities every day for them to exercise their agency to make choices and control their environment. And it makes sense that this could be positively valenced if we think about the evolutionary benefits of action. animals that are motivated to act, to go out and do things in the world, are likely to be more successful than animals that have less of that motivation. So if we think about what does a good life look like for a wild animal, I think that a good life is going to be one that has sort of minimized the sources of suffering that come from unmet bodily needs, come from, say, hunting and trapping, experiences of predation, habitat loss, which removes the resources that they need and the space they need to explore and control their environment. But on the positive side, you want to maintain those opportunities for pleasure. So opportunities to meet their bodily needs, to have the resources available that they need, opportunities to perform their natural behaviours, all the things that they're motivated to do, certain kinds of social interactions, social kinds of foraging, certain kinds of shelter building or seeking. The opportunities to explore their environment, having a complex environment to explore, and opportunities to exercise their agency, to make choices about what they do and where and when they do it. So to finish up then, I'll just talk a little bit about how we assess welfare in the wild. So when we think about, what is the quality of the life of a wild animal, we need to think about the sort of intensities and durations of the different experiences this animal has. It's going to have a range of different positive and negative experiences of the kind I've already talked about, and we need to compare how important they are overall for the animal. And that's why it's really important for us to be able to get out there and actually do some measurement on what wild animals are experiencing. So we can do something like this little graph here that comes from the Zoo and Aquarium Association of Australasia. You can see here there's all these different positive and negative experiences that the animal's having over time, and the sort of integration of all of those is going to tell us what the overall quality of life is like for that animal. So traditionally, we use animal welfare science to measure the welfare of wild animals, using different indicators to measure the state of animal, how well or poorly it's going, and how its welfare will change in different conditions. And we use different measures depending on how we define welfare. So there's a lot of different indicators that we can use to gain information, physiological and behavioural indicators like heart rate or blood cortisol, presence of stereotypic behaviours, preference tests. All these different things will help tell us something about how well or poorly an animal is doing. But in the wild, this measurement of welfare, this kind of research is still quite rare. So most of the measures that are used in wild animals are measures of stress or, say, body condition, how much weight they're carrying. And these are not directly tied to the affective state of animals. These are much more tied to their bodily function, which actually saw is only part of what makes up the welfare of an animal. And so what's really needed here is further development and validation and application of measures that relate directly to what an animal is experiencing. And there are additional challenges here because feasibility in the field is very different than it is in a laboratory or a farm setting. So one welfare framework that's been used in this sort of setting, which is really useful, is the 5 domains. And here it's looking at how an animal's welfare assessment works in comparison to 5 different domains of experience. So, how its nutrition, its living environment, its health and fitness, and also its behavioural opportunities. And then these are all framed through their impact on the mental state of the animal. So it's coming back to that, how the animal is feeling. And this has been applied fairly successfully so far, it seems, in studies that have looked at the welfare of free-roaming horses and tried to quantify how well their lives are going and what are the different welfare challenges that they're facing. So applying this to different kinds of wild animals might be a fruitful way forwards. And in general, just thinking about what an animal is like, what kind of motivations it has, and what the world is like from its point of view, helps us to decide what is good and bad for this animal and what we should be doing for them. And that allows us to assess our different actions. So if we think of our current actions or practices or proposed actions of things we want to do in the future, we can think about how are these going to impact wild animals? How are they going to impact their lives? How are they going to increase the sources of suffering or decrease the opportunities for pleasure? And based on this, we can make policy recommendations for ongoing protection. And particularly to think about interventions that could prevent sources of suffering and promote positive experiences. So here, for example, I've got a picture of an industrial chicken farm, and that has led to the incubation of bird flu, which is now spreading in the wild and causing suffering to a lot of wild animals. So if we really want to think about protecting wild animals, we need to think about how our different policies are impacting them. So to conclude, animal welfare we should think of as relating to the affective state of an animal and what it feels. And when we think about wild animals, they have many different sources of positive experience that arise from different things like meeting their bodily needs, from performing natural behaviours, and exploring their environment and exercising their agency. So all of these things sort of contribute to what a good life looks like for a wild animal. But right now what we need is more research to be able to identify all these different sources of positive and negative welfare for wild animals. And then we can use this information to assess the impact of different interventions or different actions that we're taking that might affect wild animals. And when we're assessing what these are doing, it's important that we count both the positive and negative aspects. So not just what suffering are they doing, is it sort of creating in the wild, but what sort of opportunities for pleasure might we be preventing as well if we intervene and control animals in different kinds of ways. So if we think about animal welfare, not just in terms of the suffering, but in terms of what a positive welfare experience or what a good life looks like for wild animals, we can get a much richer sense of what it is that we need to do to be able to help them live well. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather, for an enlightening and interesting talk. There are a couple of questions. We should hopefully get at least 2 in. So first one, which I think touches on your theme of how animals feel. So as humans impacting or interacting with animals, what is more important for us to try to achieve? Us to not cause them to feel negative effects, or trying to promote them having positive experiences? Did you get that?
Oh, yep, there we go. Now it's working.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, both things are really important. And a big part of that question comes down to what the relative intensities of those different experiences are. And so most of the time, I mean, we can tell from our own experience that experiencing something bad is sort of worse for us than experiencing something positive is good. So, if you had the choice between removing a source of pain or adding a source of pleasure, you'll typically choose to remove the source of pain first. And so I think there's this sort of extra moral weight on getting rid of the sources of severe suffering before we look at adding experiences of pleasure. And also because in many cases, you're not really capable of processing or experiencing positive states until the sources of suffering are removed. So, if you're in extreme pain, you're not really interested in going out and eating a tasty meal or something like that. So I think from that point of view, the priority of removing suffering is a high one. And also we might think in cases where we're responsible for causing that suffering, there might be extra reasons, such as reasons of justice, that's already been talked about, that we might have for doing that as well.
Okay, great. And there is a question linked to that, which is, won't animals that are injured find a way to still function even with their crucial injuries?
Yeah, I think that's correct. But I think, what counts as functioning and what counts as flourishing might be 2 very different things. And so, we might think that an animal's getting by, and because animals do have this sort of very strong motivation, as all of us do, to keep on living, they will keep on getting by. But I think, to say that they're just as well off as they would have been if they'd not received the injury is not going to be the same thing, because not only will they be likely to be experiencing pain, but they're also likely to be limited in performing some of the natural behaviours that they would have otherwise performed.
Okay, that's great. And just one more. You've clearly explained how a wide range of activities may lead to positive experiences. Could you envisage a situation where only positive experiences prevail, or would there need to be some negative registrations in an animal's experience bank?
Okay, yeah, that's an excellent question. So, when you imagine this sort of perfect world, it's easy to think that, animals should have only a range of positive experiences. But the problem with that is that, a lot of positive experiences rely on having negative experiences at some point in the life. You can't have the pleasures of meeting your bodily needs if you don't kind of have the displeasures of having those needs in the first place. And a lot of challenges that you might undergo, particularly in early life, that help you to develop a sense of fear, to learn, what you should be avoiding in the environment, to learn, how to navigate through the failures in trying to extract food or hunt your prey or whatever it is. All these things will be negative experiences in the short term, but then in the long term may have a positive payout. So I think the goal should never be to remove all negative experiences. It's more to try and manage those, within a reasonable level and make sure that the overall balance is positive so that the experiences are weighed out by something that they sort of benefit from in the future.
That's excellent, thanks. You actually have another couple of questions that have been coming in, but I am conscious I've been given the brief to try and keep us to time, and we now have a break for refreshments. So I don't know if you can actually see the questions, but we'll look at how we might get them to you so you can get written answers of them. So if I can just thank all of our speakers this morning for excellent presentations in this first session. As Pete said in his introduction, the speakers in this first session are not coming together as a panel, but if you have questions, keep putting the questions using the question pane, and we'll try and come back to those. We now have a break for refreshments of a little under half an hour, so we will be back at 11:15. Thank you very much for an enlightening first panel.